All right, in this section, we're going to talk a lot about the biology of stress specifically and how that affects within the body different systems that respond to stressors. All right, so specifically looking at this, we can talk about stress sort of from an evolutionary perspective as well. And we talked a little bit about how stress can be a good thing. And generally, we want to respond to stress in a specific way, right? We want to be able to respond to good stress to keep us motivated and achieving, but we also want to respond to bad stress to keep us, well, alive and healthy. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that we evolve these systems and these ways to respond to different stressors in our environment. And so we can talk a little bit about this idea of homeostasis, or basically the natural balance within our body. And stress acts to disrupt this homeostasis to get us to mobilize these systems in response to stress. And so we might disrupt this homeostasis, which causes severe reactions and changes within our body. These can be good or bad, depending on the type of stress that we're responding to. And so we can see that there's a few regions of the brain that are specifically responsible and highly related to stress. And we've studied these using different neuroimaging techniques like EEG or fMRI to see what happens to these regions of the brain when participants undergo different stressful situations. And three of the main regions that come up and we see activity due to stress are specifically in the amygdala, which is a big part of fear response and just general hyperreactivity to things. We also see activity in the hippocampus, which we know is due to memory. And I find this really interesting in how it ties into stress because, well, we want to have a solid memory of something that is bad or stressful because we want to be able to then identify it more quickly in the future. So we have these strong memory associations with highly stressful events as well as a way to help us detect and remember them in future settings. And then lastly, we also see activity in the prefrontal cortex, which again, we know has to do with higher level thought processing. And this might be due to us trying to interpret what this stressor is, understand it, and make the best or most appropriate actions in response to that. In terms of our body's actual hormonal response to stress, we see this kind of activate through two different systems. First, we see activation within the autonomic nervous system, which is primarily responsible for the release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone that has different outcomes and sort of communicates this response to stress throughout our body. This is also interesting because we can measure cortisol pretty easily through saliva. And so when we're testing different stress scenarios in a laboratory setting or in an actual experiment, we can measure the stress response by taking saliva samples and then testing it for how much cortisol was in that saliva sample. And then the second system that we see activation in is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is primarily responsible for the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these two things kind of work hand in hand, again, to send different signals and create different responses within parts of our body to this stressful situation. Breaking down that first system a little bit more, that autonomic nervous system, we see that it breaks down farther into both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And these two things, again, kind of balance each other out to create that homeostasis. And when they're in imbalance, specifically the sympathetic nervous system, if that is activated to a higher degree, it creates that fight or flight response within our body. And so we see heightened activity and we have sort of that response to deal with the threat, deal with that stressor, and find a way to overcome the situation, either through fighting our way through it or running away and removing ourselves from that situation entirely. And so we talk about stress and its effect on these different systems within the body, understanding how stress activates these different systems and how these systems help regulate different components of our body is really kind of a good way to understand this response and understand the relationship between stress and the activity and regulation of these systems within our body.